I'm at the Techonomy conference, and there's a great debate going on about how technology can improve the future of America. One of the most articulate, but perhaps soft-spoken advocates of the benefit of technology is Scott Cook, the co-founder of Intuit and the current chairman of the executive committee, some chairman of something or other at Intuit. Scott, welcome to TechCrunch TV.
It's good to be here.
Scott, last night you talked in a very, maybe not low-key, but quiet way about how cautiously optimistic you were about technology and the technology business on the broader economy and society. Could you talk more about that?
Oh gosh, yes. No, I think we're living in a wonderful age. An age where things are changing in ways that will make our lives as consumers, users, members of society, and as employees vastly better. Last night I talked about an explosion of a new way of leading, which is leading by experiment. So rather than the boss being the Caesar who makes the decisions for everything, instead, how can you build a system so the best ideas prove themselves? What that does is it enfranchises the most junior people in a company. Because if you make decisions on judgment, it's the highest paid judgment that wins. If you make decisions on experiment, then it's the best idea that can win. And often those are from the youngest, most junior people in a company. That's just one change that we're seeing today happen in company after company.
Where have you seen that most actively experimented with? What companies are sufficiently democratizing themselves to be paragons of what you're talking about?
I think you see fast cycle experimentation in Google, particularly in the search business. It's part of how they beat Yahoo. You see it operating in Amazon. You see it operating inside our company, where there's some businesses we're in now that we would never have done. The bosses said no. But because we try to run on experiments, the junior people with the idea got to run the experiment. By God, it worked. And they ran more experiments and it kept working. And we've got businesses today in India, for example, here in the US, that are entire results of experiments. In some cases, there were failures along the way. But as long as you keep experimenting, you use those to learn, and those drive our decisions.
What is it about technology, or perhaps the world, that has enabled somebody, say, like Mark Zuckerberg at 23, 24, to become such a powerful CEO, where in the history of capitalism and of corporate life that has never happened before?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most wonderful things we're seeing. Because some of the most brilliant ideas have been done by the young. Einstein was 19 when he published his first work. I think Zuckerberg was about 19. Bill Gates started his company in his early 20s. The unleashing of that energy and that leadership at a young age is a profound thing that's happening today. Now, what enables it? I think it's a collection of things how one person today, without a large organization, can do things that change the world. In the past, that was never possible. But today, you could have a Sean Fanning, who did Napster, who was also, I think, 19 at the time. Within a year, was changing how music was consumed. That's now possible because we have a medium that allows a single person to have impact reverberating around the world, not just through ideas, but through actual action. And that's all a creation of technology. It never existed before. It was not possible before the last 10, 20 years.
At the beginning of, I don't usually bring this book up at TechCrunch, but since you seem to be very learned, I'll bring it up. At the beginning of Plato's Republic, there's a long riff about the value of experience in old age. And of course, Plato's Republic has become the cornerstone, historically was the cornerstone of Western civilization and wisdom. Do you think we need to rethink the relationship between wisdom and old age?
I think we have to look at how wisdom is gained and what sort of things improve judgment. Generally, it's when you try things and find out what works and doesn't. When you exercise your judgment, you have a hypothesis, and then you test it, and then you learn. And that then refines your judgment, because you learned what worked and what didn't work. So when we move to fast cycle experimentation inside the company, where people and teams can run experiments in weeks or days, that increases the cycle, the learning cycle, that is the very thing that builds judgment, builds knowledge. And that can be built at very young ages, very short tenures inside companies, in an environment where you let people run experiments rapidly and learn from them.
How can we teach older people to go back to experimentation, especially senior managers, maybe even mid-managers in large companies?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the key place it has to be taught. Because junior people in companies, they want to run experiments. They want to try their ideas out. They want to see their ideas work in the market. And then
where's your evidence for that, by the way? Is it just something you notice? Is it anecdotal, or are you finding it within you into it?
Yeah, we add into it. When we get out of the way, when we give people the tools to run experiments, they naturally do it. Because they've got ideas. Everyone's got ideas they want to see work in the world. The more junior you are, the more you seem to have those ideas, and the more they're stymied by traditional hierarchical organizations. So we have no problem stimulating people to become wildly inventive as soon as we can get the company out of the way and get the company supporting and accelerating. So who does that? That's what leaders do. The role of leaders, in my view, is not to make the decision. The role of leaders is to frame the giant challenge. Like in our case, how do we improve the financial lives of people in India? So frame the challenge and then build systems that make it easy for junior people to test their ideas on how to achieve that grand challenge. And then savor the results, savor the surprises, and then as a leader, live by the same rules. So your ideas need to be subject to experiment, just as junior people's.
Scott, do you think it's any coincidence that the countries, or the industrialized countries now in the most crisis, particularly Greece and Italy, are ones that have historically and currently still run by what one might kindly say are gerontocracies?
That'd be an interesting subject of study. I don't think I have the data to give you an insight on that. I'd say it's maybe not an age thing. It's maybe related to a tradition. If your tradition is one of looking to the past, looking at what once worked, reflected through analysis, you're probably not getting with the program to understand what will work. And so I think it's more, are you backward looking or forward looking? One of the things that's amazing when I visit China is they're so forward looking. I mean, this country's been through upheavals, huge upheavals, multiple in the last 100 years. And do they look back at that? No, they're so laser focused on the future. And I think, and then learning and figuring out what works. Some of the experiment techniques that I learned in China. Some were in Japan, countries who have modernized most rapidly in the last 100 years. I think are much better off than countries who were modern for a few hundred years. And I think part of it is that focus on the future.
I get the sense that you're a little pessimistic, certainly about the American political system, which clearly is lagging behind the technology sector and the general business area. How can America modernize its political sector? How can we re-educate politicians? Or perhaps reinvent politics and politicians?
Well, I don't know much about politics.
But you're interested in it.
But I have learned a little over time, or at least I think I have, on leadership. And ultimately, an elected leader needs to be a leader. And I think, for example, take the government sector. Most folks aren't that happy with the performance of the government sector, either its productivity, the quality of its service, how the citizens are treated. And yet a government sector is an essential part of a modern society. How can you run the government sector, which has been large and increasing over the last few decades, to be highly productive, high performance? Well, it actually has been done in some countries. An example that I use is Singapore. When you ride on Singapore Airlines, you're riding on a government-owned institution. That's a piece of the Singapore government. And yet the quality is some of the best in the world. Now, how does that happen? We should all aspire to have our government agencies run as well as Singapore Airlines. And it's not an accident. Singapore runs national testing. They find the best high school students in the entire country. They give them free ride scholarships to the best schools outside of Singapore for college and for grad school on this deal, that if you take our scholarship to study at Oxford or Harvard or MIT, when you come back to Singapore, you have to spend that number of years working for the government. So now they have some of the best and brightest coming into their government at a formative age. Then the Singapore government can tell from their workload during those 4 or 6 years which are the best, who is not only bright, but can get things done, who can execute, who can lead. And then the government holds on to those people. And those become the government leaders in the agencies in Singapore. And then they pay market rates. So they don't leave to get a better salary elsewhere, because the Singapore government runs salary studies. And they know to keep them, they're going to have to pay for a major cabinet secretary 1.6 million in annual salary. But because of that, they get great leaders. Now there's an old rule. If you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. Singapore has avoided that by paying market rates. Unfortunately, in countries which live by that rule, sometimes the leadership in government is not as good as it should be.
Scott, final question. Is there any contradiction between these two strands in your thinking? On the one hand, you're calling for revolution from below. You're suggesting that the old need to give up authority and that we need to reinvent companies and turn them upside down. On the other hand, your model, at least in political terms, is Singapore, which is, in all fairness, an authoritarian system which has barely engaged any kind of democracy. Is that a fair criticism? I mean, if America, for example, was to adopt the Singapore model, then it would reflect, I think, a failure of democracy, wouldn't it?
Oh, I don't think so. I'm not advocating how politicians are elected. I'm only talking about what they do once they're in the job. What does a leader in government do, regardless of how the leader got there? In the US, some of our leaders are elected, others are appointed. But all leaders need to lead in a way that generates the innovations and the ideas and improves the results. And one sector which hasn't run experiments in the US, so hasn't learned by comparing alternate policies in an A/B test, the way businesses do, the way science does, one sector that hasn't done that is the government. Can you actually set government policy by experiment? I think you can. And one country has, and that's China. And the story I tell is when Deng Xiaoping took over China, absolute authority. He could do whatever he wanted, but he knew the country was bankrupt. They starving, grinding poverty. They could not generate the jobs to feed themselves. So he did many things, but one he did was experiment. One experiment was he put a fence around Shenzhen and ran the area of Shenzhen under different economic rules. They ran under free market rules while the rest of the country was locked in a communist economic system. It was an A/B test. They watched the test, and the Shenzhen economy exploded. Foreign investment came in, jobs, great jobs. That experiment proved the value of moving to that system. When they then expanded the results of that test, the Chinese economic miracle began. Since then, over 300 million people have been liberated from grinding poverty and now lead comfortable middle-class lives. That's the greatest anti-poverty program ever in world history. And it was the result of an experiment, an A/B test in government policy.
Well, Scott Cook, on that incredibly provocative and perhaps in some ways troubling note, I want to thank you so much for appearing on TechCrunch TV.
Oh, glad to be here. Thank you.